Madam President, we're here on another day in the Senate facing another political gimmick. That's the way things seem to work in the Democrat Senate, and that's what's happening yet again this week. Yesterday, Democrats introduced their latest, designed to fail, the Bring Jobs Home Act. It's a bill that they know is not going to pass. The reason I say the bill's only designed to fail is because it's already failed. It's been voted on here before in the previous Congress, but that's not stopping the Democrats. The Bring Jobs Home Act would supposedly encourage American companies to bring jobs back home to the United States and to discourage companies from sending jobs overseas. But the bill completely ignores the real problem and the reason American companies are sending jobs overseas. America's broken tax code and our sky-high tax rate on business. America has one of the highest corporate tax rates in the developed world, and many companies simply can't afford to pay it and stay profitable. So if Democrats were truly serious about solving the problem of American jobs going overseas, they'd be sitting down with Republicans to hammer out reform of our tax code. We should be substantially lowering overall tax rates to allow American businesses to keep jobs here at home while remaining competitive in the global marketplace. Instead of serious reform, however, Democrats have chosen to take up a bill that would do nothing to address the real problem that we're dealing with. Democrats aren't bringing up this bill in the hopes of actually fixing problems. They're bringing it up in hopes of winning a few votes in the November election. This isn't a secret, Madam President. When Democrats first brought this bill up 2 years ago ahead of the 2012 election, Reuters described it as an example of members of Congress, and I quote, offering up measures they know will not pass but can be used to fire up their respective supporters in the run-up to November's elections, end quote. That's from 2 years ago when this was brought up the last time. That, Mr. President, has been Democrats' preferred method of operating in the Senate this year. Back in March, the New York Times reported that Democrats plan to spend the spring and summer on messaging votes timed, and I quote, to coincide with the campaign-style trips made by President Obama, end quote. That's from the New York Times earlier this year. Democrats concede, the Times continued, that making new laws is not really the point. Rather, they're trying to force Republicans to vote against them. That's a quote from the New York Times story from a few months back, that making new laws is not really the point. What we're talking about here, Madam President, isn't fixing problems. It's just creating political opportunities. Madam President, 5.5 years of Democrat policies have left American families hurting. Unemployment, which the President's advisors predicted would fall below 6% in 2012, is still above 6% 2 years later. Almost 10 million Americans are unemployed, 3.1 million of them for 6 months or longer. And those numbers would be even worse if so many Americans hadn't given up on finding work and dropped out of the labor force altogether. Our current labor force participation rate is at lows that we haven't seen literally since the 1970s during the presidency of Jimmy Carter. And in fact, Madam President, if the labor participation rate were today what it was when the President took office, the unemployment rate right now wouldn't be a little over 6%, it would be 10.2%. That's how many people have quit looking for work entirely. Household income has plummeted by more than $3,300 on the President's watch. At the same time, prices have risen. Food prices have increased. The price of gas has nearly doubled. College costs continue to soar. And family health insurance premiums have skyrocketed by almost $3,000 despite the President's promise that they would fall. And what do you get when you combine high prices, fewer opportunities for employment and advancement, and reduced income? You get a lot of struggling middle-class families. And instead of spending this year taking up serious legislation to help those families, Democrats, by their own admission, have spent this year on political show votes that they hope will win them a few votes in the November election. Well, Madam President, last week the Congressional Budget Office issued its yearly long-term budget outlook. The news on that front was grim. The Congressional Budget Office reported that as early as 2039, under its baseline scenario, the nation could see public debt reach 106% of GDP, which would be a level of debt seen only once before in our nation's history. By 2039, under an alternative fiscal scenario, the debt to GDP ratio could rise to more than 180% of GDP. By comparison, Greece's current debt to GDP ratio is 175%. In other words, Madam President, our economy could go the way of Greece's in just a few short years if nothing is done. We have to take up significant budget reform and reduce the size of government. Look for ways that we can make government work more effectively, more efficiently. Reform programs that need to be reformed. Chipping away around the edges isn't going to get the job done. It's not going to cut it, Madam President. Even before the President came into office, our national debt presented a serious and pressing problem. But over the past 5.5 years of the current administration, the problems got exponentially worse. If you look at our total debt, which includes the public debt and intergovernmental debt, when President Obama came into office, our national debt was $10.6 trillion. That's the total debt. Today, just 5.5 years later, our national total debt stands at $17.6 trillion. That's a 66% increase on the President's watch. Madam President, that's horrifying. And yet President Obama and his party continue to act as if our country isn't hurtling toward a fiscal crisis. Among the President's many fiscally irresponsible policies, Obamacare stands out as one of the worst offenders. Former Congressional Budget Office Director Douglas Holes-Eakin has estimated that the President's health care law will increase the deficits by hundreds of billions of dollars in its first 10 years alone, and by more than $1.5 trillion over the next 10. Political reports that the Congressional Budget Office attributes the coming growth of the debt to, among other things, and I quote, rising health care costs and the expansion of subsidies offered through Obamacare, end quote. So much for the President's claim that the health care law would be, and I quote, the largest deficit reduction plan in over a decade. But that's par for the course for the Affordable Care Act. The President also promised that the law would reduce Americans' health insurance premiums by $2,500. Instead, as I mentioned, they've already risen by almost $3,000, and they're still going up. I'd like to just read a few headlines from this past week. This is from Kaiser Health News yesterday, and I quote, Florida's biggest health insurance signals rate hikes ahead. From the Nebraska Radio Network yesterday, this is an expert talking. Nebraskans' premiums may bounce 30% under Obamacare, end quote. From the Nashville Business Journal last Wednesday, here come higher premiums. Tennessee's insurance providers request rate increases, end quote. From the Associated Press last Tuesday, Delawareans could face higher rates under the Affordable Care Act, end quote. From the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and I quote, some insurance carriers looking for double-digit increases for Affordable Care Act policies, end quote. Madam President, that's just a sample of some of the headlines from newspapers around this country just this last week. I could go on about the health care law's broken promises. I could also talk about the fact that the President promised that Americans would be able to keep their doctors in hospitals, but that Americans are now finding that the new health plans exclude doctors and hospitals that they've been using literally for years. Or the fact that the health care bill was supposed to give more Americans access to health care, but that many Americans are struggling to find doctors who will take their Obamacare insurance. One doctor reporting on her patient's experience with the Obamacare plan said, and I quote, we're running into problems with coverage in the same way we were when they were uninsured, end quote. Let me repeat that, Madam President. This is from a doctor talking about one of her patients' experience with an Obamacare plan. We're running into problems with coverage in the same way we were when they were uninsured. If that doesn't sum up the law's failure, I don't know what does. Then there was the President's promise that shopping for health care on the exchanges would be like buying a TV on Amazon or a plane ticket on Kayak. As Americans quickly found out and are still finding out almost 10 months later, shopping on the exchanges is a lot more like the world's most nightmarish experience with the DMV. Madam President, Obamacare is failing Americans, and so is the Obama economy. And instead of focusing on making things better, Democrats are focused on trying to get reelected in November. Madam President, Republicans have solutions to the challenges facing the American people. Solutions like approving the Keystone Pipeline and the tens of thousands of jobs that it would support. Repealing the Obamacare 30-hour workweek provision, which is slashing employees' hours and wages. Stopping the job-killing national energy tax, which will eliminate hundreds of thousands of jobs and drive up Americans' energy bills. Enacting trade promotion authority to open new markets to American farmers, workers, and businesses. Repealing the medical device tax, which is costing American jobs and increasing the cost of health care. And passing real health care reform, the kind that will lower costs, increase choice, and put Americans back in charge of their health care. If Democrats were serious about helping American families, they'd be working with us on these priorities instead of tying up the Senate with partisan legislation. And they'd be taking up the 40 House-passed jobs bills currently gathering dust on the majority leader's desk. Madam President, every day the Senate spends on designed-to-fail bills, designed-to-fail legislation, things that we know aren't going anywhere, is a day the Senate is not spending on bills to provide real relief to the American people. It is high time, Madam President, for Democrats to stop wasting time on partisan legislation and to start working with Republicans on real reform. Middle-class, middle-income families around this country have been squeezed for long enough. The American people have been waiting long enough. There are 40 House-passed jobs bills waiting for action here in the United States Senate. And instead, we're spending week after week after week of the Senate's time voting on bills that are designed to fail, that are designed to do nothing more than score political points heading into an election. That is wrong on so many levels, Madam President. Most of all, it's wrong for the American people, and it has to change. Madam President.